Okay. Where agents are heterogeneous with respect to productivity, education, income, assets, asset holdings, and so on. They are clearly a workhorse of modern macroeconomics, and they have been very successful in a vast range of subfields of macroeconomics to study issues such as consumption and saving behavior, labor supply, labor market dynamics, and social insurance policy, for example, the effects of extended unemployment benefits on the consumption of the unemployed and on the re-employment probability of the job seekers, fiscal policy and redistribution, and obviously, one of the key questions of our times, the determinants of inequality in income and wealth and the changes in inequality. At the same time, though, the quantitative analysis of the macroeconomic effects of monetary policy is still very much carried out in what we call representative agent dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. So in models where there is this fiction of a representative agent where there is essentially no meaningful heterogeneity whatsoever in the model. And I'm giving you here two examples of models that are essentially the DSG models that are used at the Fed and at the ECB. And these are basically representative agent models that, for those of you who are familiar with this literature, essentially versions of the Smets and Wouters model. Okay? So now there are reasons why this is the case. In the study of monetary policy, it's important to model aggregate fluctuations, aggregate shocks, and there is a tradition of estimating fully the model, doing a full estimation using Bayesian methods and time series. And both aggregate shocks and full estimations are relatively difficult to do with heterogeneous agent models. It's a lot more challenging to do that. But is this a good enough reason not to use models with more heterogeneity to study monetary policy? And the answer that I'm going to try to give you today is no. It's no, because there is a lot to learn already from heterogeneous agent models in terms of monetary policy analysis. Okay? And I'm trying to convince you of that by describing a framework that I have developed with Greg Kaplan and Ben Moll in the last year or so, which is an equilibrium framework for quantitative analysis of monetary policy, for which we coined an acronym, a friendly acronym, HANK, which stands for Heterogeneous Agents, New Keynesian Models. Okay? So what is HANK? So HANK is a model that is built on two pillars, on two building blocks. The first building block, which is the HA block, allows a rich representation of consumption and saving behavior and household portfolios, okay? So it basically is going to give us a very rich representation of how households consume, save, and how they allocate their assets between the different classes of securities. Here we build on a long tradition that goes back to Truman Bewley and then Haggett, Ayagari, Krusell and Smith. But I'm going to talk about a recent incarnation of this class of models that I built with Greg Kaplan, which is a particular version of the model that has two assets, a liquid asset and an illiquid asset, where the notion of liquidity is going to be really central. The second building block of HANK is the NK, which is nominal price rigidity. So basically the idea that prices are sticky. Prices don't adjust. They're not perfectly flexible. And this is the reason why monetary policy has real effects in the short run. In the long run, money is neutral, like in most models. But in the short run, in this model, monetary policy has effect because of sticky prices, basically. This is sort of the industry standard in monetary policy analysis, and goes back to a very deep insight by Mike Woodford, it's called in the literature the cashless limit. So the idea basically is that in these models, money is not a medium of exchange. Okay? It doesn't really solve any informational friction or any double coincidence problems, but it's only a unit of account. And what the central bank does controls a nominal interest rate. That's the monetary policy tool. And because of the price rigidities, because of prices are sticky, by changing the nominal interest rate, if the prices are sticky, there is an effect on the real rate, and the real rate affects the rest of the economy. So today, what I'm going to do, basically, I'm going to try to contrast this view of monetary policy in two models, in Hank and in what we call rank. Rank is the representative agent, new Keynesian model, okay? So it's going to be the war between Hank and rank. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an intuition. So in this view of monetary policy, what the Fed does, the Fed basically changes the nominal interest rate, so the federal fund rate. And the way, in the standard model, this has real effects into the economy is the following. Okay? So suppose that, suppose you have like $2 in your pocket, and you can choose whether to spend the $2 today, $2 tomorrow, or you can choose to spend $1 today and $1 tomorrow. Okay? What determines this trade-off, this intertemporal trade-off, from the perspective of an individual, is mostly the interest rate on your savings, right? So suppose that now the interest rate is such that, your optimal choice, your ideal choice is that of spending $1 today and then saving $1 so you can spend 1 plus R, the interest rate, tomorrow. What the central bank can do, it can lower the interest rate so that basically it pushes you to spend the $2 today. Instead of $1, you spend $2 today, and you don't save for tomorrow. By spending more today, the demand for consumption goes up. If the demand for consumption goes up, what firms do, they hire more labor. They hire more labor demand goes up, the wage goes up. Households have more wages to spend, so they spend more, and so on. So you see, basically what the monetary policy does, it triggers what is called a Keynesian multiplier, and this Keynesian multiplier expands the aggregate economy. Okay? This is the typical argument for why monetary policy is effective and has stabilization power in this class of models, and has entirely basically to do with intertemporal substitution, with this idea that by changing the interest rate, you can affect the extent to which basically households postpone or decide to postpone consumption or decide to preempt consumption. Now, I'm going to think about basically the real effect of monetary policy through the lenses of an heterogeneous agent framework. Okay? And I'm going to ask 3 questions in particular. The first one is, okay, is the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, so the one that I just described basically, okay, which is the transmission mechanism of monetary policy in rank, in the representative agent model, is the transmission mechanism different? And the answer is going to be yes. It's going to be yes because it turns out that the general equilibrium effects are going to dominate sharply this intertemporal substitution channel that I just described. Second, are the real effects of monetary policy larger or smaller than what predicted by the representative agent model? And I'm going to argue that, well, it depends. It depends on the reaction of fiscal policy. So in particular, in contrast to the representative agent model, models with heterogeneity and incomplete markets of the type that I'm going to be working on feature what is called deviation from Ricardian neutrality. Okay? So basically, they're non-Ricardian, which means that fiscal policy really matters. And so the answer to question 2 is that whether the real effects of monetary policy are stronger or weaker depends on the reaction of fiscal policy. And I'm going to explain that in detail. Then, points 1 and 2 are really about what is called conventional monetary policy, so changes in the nominal interest rate. But, in the context of the Great Recession and the zero lower bound, there was a big discussion on unconventional monetary policy, right? So new ways, basically, to stimulate the economy and stabilize the economy. And one of these was forward guidance. So basically, the central bank announcing a future change in the interest rate, and the economy reacting today to this announcement. So I'm going to show that in the standard representative agent model, there is a puzzle in a way, because forward guidance seems to be extremely powerful. The central bank seems to have a lot of power by announcing a change in the future, which is kind of puzzling because it doesn't seem plausible at all. And in this heterogeneous agent model, instead, forward guidance is going to be weaker. And it's going to be weaker because in these heterogeneous agent models, the key players are the hand-to-mouth households. And the hand-to-mouth households, which provide the initial stimulus to aggregate demand, if the change in interest rates in the future, they don't respond today. And so the initial stimulus will be much, much weaker. Okay? So that's basically the reason why forward guidance is much weaker, which is a more reasonable result. Okay, so I'm going to start with a summary of the how monetary policy works in these representative agent models, okay? Quickly, and then I'm going to move to heterogeneous agent models. So I'm going to start, so this presentation is going to be a little bit technical, but I'll try to give you as much intuition as possible. So I'm going to start from a really very, very simple model. Really the most stylized version of the representative agent model. It's one where households have CRI utility with intertemporal substitution equal to 1 over gamma, and discount the future at rate rho. Technology is such that output is produced only with labor. And prices are perfectly rigid. Okay? That's where basically the simplification is. The fact that there is perfect price rigidity, which allows to basically solve the model pencil and paper. So what the monetary authority does is sets the path for the real interest rate. It affects the real interest rate directly because prices are rigid, so by affecting the nominal interest rate, it affects the real interest rate. And it affects the real interest rate through this, imagine through this equation here that says that basically the real interest rate returns to its initial value with speed equal to rho. So rho very high, a high value of rho, of eta, a high value of eta means that the shock is very transitory. A low value of eta means that the shock is very persistent. Equilibrium is just demand for consumption equal to production, C equal to Y. And, okay, this is a bit technical, but this model, the way it's set up, has multiple equilibria. So in order to basically pin down on equilibrium, we just assume that consumption goes back to steady state. Now, if you just write down the Euler equation from this model and you integrate it out, you obtain this expression for consumption. And if you differentiate the expression for consumption with respect to the interest rate today, you obtain this simple expression here, which is basically the elasticity of consumption to the monetary policy tool, to the real interest rate, okay? Which is simply 1 over gamma eta. So intertemporal substitution, basically, which is 1 over gamma, determines the size of the response of consumption to the monetary policy instrument. And obviously, the lower its eta, the more permanent is the shock, the stronger is the effect. But the key thing here is that the total effect is basically determined by intertemporal substitution purely, which is exactly the intuition that I gave you earlier of the agent with the $2 today or $2 tomorrow. Now, let's move to the transmission mechanism. So basically, you can show that you can decompose the total response of consumption today into 2 components. What I'm going to call the direct response and the indirect effect. The direct response, which is given by the first integral, is basically the intertemporal substitution effect. The second component is the general equilibrium effect. So here, as I said, when imagine like the central bank reducing the interest rate, this reduction in the interest rate increases the demand for consumption, which increases the demand for labor, employment goes up, income goes up, and because income goes up, households consume more. Okay? The second part is the general equilibrium feedback of the Keynesian multiplier, if you like, that can be written basically as the derivative of the initial consumption with respect to the future sequence of income. Now, in our simple example, you can show that the direct response is eta over rho plus eta, and the indirect effect is just rho over rho plus eta, and the 2 sum to 1, obviously, the 2 components. Why is that? Well, eta, remember, remember, the higher is eta, the more transitory is the shock, which clearly means that intertemporal substitution is stronger there. Because the more transitory is the monetary policy shock, the more intertemporal substitution there is. And what is rho? Rho is, in this model, the marginal propensity to consume out of transitory income changes. It's a discount rate, which is basically the household, the representative household is a permanent income consumer. So the marginal propensity to consume is equal to the discount rate. And the change in income essentially is transitory because the change in the real interest rate is transitory. So if you choose plausible parameterization, so that rho implies, this is a discount rate, so an interest rate of say 2% annually, and eta is 0.5, which means a half-life of 2 quarters, which is the typical mean reversion of a monetary policy shock. What you find is basically is that eta is 100 times larger than rho, right? So this means that the first component, the direct effect, intertemporal substitution, is absolutely dominant in this model. So in this model, monetary policy works entirely because of intertemporal substitution. The general equilibrium forces are are almost insignificant. Good. So that's my second point. My third point is about forward guidance. And okay, so suppose the Fed announces a cut in the interest rate at a future date tau. Okay, we're at time 0, and it says I'm going to cut interest rate, in 8 quarters. Well, what this model tells you the following. Again, you do a little bit of math. It tells you that the effect of the future change in the interest rate on consumption today, on household consumption today, is exactly the same as the effect of a cut in the interest rate today. Okay? So forward guidance is equally as effective as conventional monetary policy. This is a bit of a knife edge case. In fact, if you relax the perfect price rigidity assumption that allows us to do the math simply, then it turns out the forward guidance is even more powerful than conventional monetary policy, right? Why? Because forward guidance triggers a larger rise in expected inflation that feeds back into an even lower real interest rate today and a stronger rise in consumption through intertemporal substitution, again. So this is a result in a recent paper by Del Negro, Gianluca, and Patterson, which really deepens the puzzle because it says, forward guidance is even more powerful than conventional monetary policy. So, to summarize, just in words, in rank, basically, it's really all about intertemporal substitution. That is, the reason why you get real effects from monetary policy is because of households' intertemporal substitution between, future consumption and current consumption. And it's true in this little toy model that I solved, but it's true also in medium-scale monetary DSG models that are used in central banks, like the Smiths and Wouters models. So, what is wrong with this logic? Well, I would say a whole lot of evidence. A whole lot of evidence is wrong. So, in particular, from the data, we know that the sensitivity of aggregate consumption to the interest rate is weak. Okay? And this is what is known as the failure of the aggregate Euler equation in the literature. The data also indicate a strong sensitivity of consumption to transitory income shock, and this is what is known as excess sensitivity, the excess sensitivity puzzle in the literature. Also, we know from a lot of data that the marginal propensity to consume among households are vastly heterogeneous. They depend on the asset level, they depend on the level of income, on the level of wealth, they depend on the portfolio composition of households, whether they have debt or they only have assets and no liabilities. And people have talked about household balance sheet effects in the context of the last recession when thinking about the consumption response to the shock of households that are very highly leveraged, for example, in their housing in the US and other countries. So these are all elements that go beyond the representative agent model And these are all elements that are instead very easy to incorporate in a richer model with heterogeneous agents. Okay? And so that's the direction where I'm going. I'm going in the direction of incorporating all these new dimensions and then re-asking kind of the questions about the transmission mechanism, the size of the effect, and forward guidance in those models. Okay? Which is what brings me to Hank. Now, with an important caveat, something that, it was discovered relatively recently, about a year ago, by Ivan Verning at MIT. He shows that actually, under some conditions, if you make a number of assumptions, very elegant assumption, but also kind of knife edge, then you can actually write a model with a lot of heterogeneity that you can actually aggregate. And you aggregate into a representative agent model, and then the predictions are exactly the same. Okay? That's a very useful result because it gives us a benchmark, and it makes us sort of think hard about, what kind of deviations from this benchmark are relevant to get different answers, so that you would get different answers. I'm not going to talk about this, but it's important to know. Okay, instead, I'm gonna build a model with the following features. So on the firm side, the model is going to be New Keynesian, entirely New Keynesian. Okay, I'm going to take it off the shelf. So there will be monopolistic competition among intermediate good producers, and these nominal price rigidities are going to be given by quadratic adjustment cost of adjusting prices a la Rothenberg, which I personally like better than the standard Calvo assumption because it gives you like state dependence in price adjustment. So households face uninsured idiosyncratic labor income risk. Imagine like unemployment risk or productivity shocks that they cannot be insured directly through markets, but they can save into assets, a liquid asset and an illiquid asset. Okay? I'm going to specify what these assets are in a second. They can obviously consume and supply labor. Okay? So these are households that they make consumption decision, labor supply decision. They receive basically wages that fluctuate because they can be subject to promotion, demotion, laid off, unemployment, and this makes the income fluctuate. And what they do, they can save, and they can save, say, in the bank account, or they can buy a house. Right? So looks like life of most of us. In the model, there is a competitive investment fund, a bank, call it a bank, that intermediates illiquid assets as capital to producers. There is a government. The government is the provider of liquid assets, of liquid debt. Okay? So the liquid debt is basically, think of that as government bonds, or the equivalent of a government bond, risk-free government bond. The government spends, and it finances expenditures, interest payments on debt, and lump sum transfers by taxing income, labor income. And then there is a monetary authority that sets the nominal interest rate based on a Taylor rule. And the nominal interest rate net of inflation is going to determine the real rate, and the real rate is what enters the household problem. Okay, so that's the description of the economy. It's a rich economy, and it can be parameterized to match a number of dimensions of actual economies, so that the quantitative answers that we get are credible and plausible. So I'm going to very quickly go over the NK part, the New Keynesian part of the model, which is completely standard. Okay? So you have these intermediate good producers that produce different types of good indexed by J that enter into the production of a final good, a consumption good, and epsilon is the elasticity of substitution across all these goods. These firms produce with capital and labor. Z is just an index for TFP, and this is the real marginal cost of a unit of output. These intermediate producers, they set prices. They set their prices, right? They face a downward sloping curve, and they set prices, but they set prices subject to adjustment cost. Changing the price too much entails a cost, And this is just a quadratic cost. So if you solve this problem and you impose symmetric equilibrium, then you get the famous Phillips curve, the Keynesian Phillips curve. Keynesian Phillips curve that states basically a relationship between inflation and the gap in marginal cost. So when marginal costs are above the desired marginal cost, which is M bar, then firms want to increase prices because they want to increase their markup, basically. They want to realign their markup to the optimal markup. They want to increase prices. So when cost goes up, the firm wants to increase prices. By increasing prices, basically, inflation goes up. Okay? So that's the way inflation responds to shocks that change the marginal cost in this model. Okay, so let me describe the household problem. This is a technical slide, but I will try to describe it in words. So these households, they discount the future at rate rho. That's the discount rate. And they also die stochastically at rate lambda. Okay, so we have this sort of perpetual youth structure a la Blanchard-Yari. They get utility from C, L, and H, which are respectively non-durable consumption. L is hours worked, so basically leisure. And H is housing services from housing. The first equation there, you have the description of all the variables here. The first equation tells us basically the law of motion for B, that is the liquid asset. B is the liquid asset. So the first budget constraint says that basically what households can do with their cash in hand. Their cash in hand is given by earnings, which is W is the wage, Z is productivity, and L is hours worked, plus a transfer, fiscal transfer that they receive from the government, minus taxes. They can consume, and RB times B is the income that that accrues on liquid savings. And notice that RB is a function of B because we're allowing for a wage between borrowing and saving. So when B is negative, households pay a premium to borrow over the interest rate. Okay? So these households, they have this cash in hand. They can consume C. They can increase their savings or decrease their savings. Or, notice, they can deposit D, some of their liquid savings, into the illiquid account. The second equation is the evolution of the illiquid account. Okay? But when they do that, they pay a transaction cost, chi, which is a function of the deposit and the amount of illiquid assets. The second equation is the evolution of this illiquid account. Okay? Now, basically, I want you to think of B as basically imagine, bank account, cash, bank account, and say treasury bonds. Okay, and A as a mix of housing and equity. So, and in fact, we made this simplifying assumption that says the following. You see this omega and 1 minus omega. We said that basically every unit that the household deposits into the liquid account is going to be split into two components. Part of it goes into housing directly, and housing gives you some flow utility. Okay, you live in the house, you get some utility from housing. And part of it stays into the illiquid account, the 1 minus omega, accrues some interest. Why? Because basically it is invested as productive capital. So this part here is what the banks intermediate to firms, and the firms invest it, they use it for production, and they return RA to households. Okay? So we have these two types of illiquid assets, and the reason why we do that because it's important to match the data, because in the data, if you look at the household portfolios basically they're composed by, in terms of illiquid asset, by housing and equity, retirement accounts that are mostly liquid. Okay, so the rest of the model is straightforward. So if you look here at this slide, in red you have all the prices that we have to determine in equilibrium, the return on the liquid asset, the return on the illiquid asset, and the wage, and then you have the tax rate and the transfer. okay, which are determined also in equilibrium through basically the government budget constraint. So you can solve the problem, the household problem, given this sequence of prices. And to close the model, I'm going to tell you how prices are determined, okay? Which are basically determined by market clearing conditions, like in any modern macro model. So the competitive labor market is going to give us a wage per efficiency unit of labor. Well, the nominal, so the bank, as I said, the central bank, as I said, follows a Taylor rule, which is basically a rule of behavior of the central bank that says that the nominal interest rate responds to inflation. Okay? So when inflation is high, the central bank increases nominal interest rate with a coefficient of proportionality phi that is greater than 1. This is the Taylor principle that you need to guarantee stability, basically, of this model, uniqueness of equilibrium stability. Okay, so basically that's the rule that determines the nominal interest rate. And notice this epsilon. This is the monetary policy shock. So we're going to be basically studying the effects of a monetary policy shock, of a shock to epsilon. So there is this banking sector, basically, that allocates funds from households to firms. And the return on these equities that are invested are the marginal product of capital plus basically the dividends, because these intermediate firms, they make profits. They're monopolistically competitive, they make profits, and the profits are paid back to households. And then there is a government budget constraint that closes the model. So notice that the government budget constraint says that tax revenues, which are the right side here, are used to pay expenditures, transfers, and interest payments on debt. Okay? So notice that when the central bank, say, cuts the interest rate, so the nominal interest rate falls, the real interest rate is going to change. So the real interest rate, the interest rate in the government budget constraint is going to fall. Okay? So something has to adjust here in this equation to balance the budget. And because Ricardian equivalence fails in this model, whether it's transfers that adjust, it's debt, or it's expenditures, is going to matter. Okay? So this is one of the takeaway of this heterogeneous agent model. As Ricardian equivalence fails, so the fiscal reaction to a monetary policy shock, what the fiscal side does in response to a monetary policy shock really matters. And I'll show you why. Okay? Let me just a second. Let me just say very quickly, in equilibrium, RA is going to be greater than RB, obviously, because RA is the return on an asset that is illiquid, for which you have to pay a cost, basically, to transact. And so in equilibrium, it has to be higher. Yes, your question? Excuse me? You
break Ricardian equivalence by having these nominal taxes and by having a credit and this illiquidity constraint.
Yeah.
So can you tell how the two connect?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So here we could, in principle, by assuming that the taxes are basically by getting rid of the distortionary taxes, and we would just have the market incompleteness. But we can do that. We cannot do the opposite because really market incompleteness is really the bread and butter of this model. But we could do something along those lines, yeah. Or we could, alternatively, we could fix, we could work with inelastic labor supply, and in that case, this would be like a lump sum tax. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the parameterization, but I want to do it not by listing parameter values, but giving you a sense of how, what this model predicts, basically. Okay, so one important feature of this model is the income risk the households facing. Okay, so these households, they face shocks to their productivity, and the type of shock that they face turns out to be really important in the model. So let me tell you how we model it. So technically, we model the the wage process, the productivity process for the individual as a sum of two orthogonal jump drift processes. Okay? So in practice, what does it mean? It means that households are subject to two types of fluctuations, two types of individual fluctuations. One that is very frequent, but it's small. So when it hits, it's frequently, but when it's small, it's very transitory, and it's also small in size. Okay? Another one that is very infrequent, it happens very rarely, but when it hits, it's big, and it's very permanent. Okay? So imagine basically the first one being, small pay rises in your job, and the second really being like career changes, like a big promotion, really a change in job, or a demotion, or just losing the job and becoming unemployed, and losing a big chunk of, say, of specific, firm-specific, of industry-specific human capital. And why do the data ask for both components? Well, you kind of see it from these plots here. Okay? Ignore the red distributions for a second. So what you see here are histograms of 1-year log earning changes and 5-year log earning changes from the model. But the data look exactly like this. Okay? Essentially, what you see is a lot of kurtosis in these distributions. Okay? So you see a big mass, basically, concentrated at around 0, and then some long tails. Now, you're going to get a lot of mass around 0 with these very frequent small shocks. And then you're going to get, basically, these tails with these large, infrequent shocks. That's the way you generate this. And the red curve there are log normal distributions with the same variance. And the reason why I put them there is I wanted to show you how different, basically, they are. Even though they have the same variance, the shape is completely different. And this is basically something new. This is something we discovered only in the last 3-4 years, thanks to work by Fatih Guvenen and other co-authors. And this is what I like to call the new view of earning dynamics. And in the context of what we do, why is it important? It's important because this has the nature of the earning shock has really important implication for the portfolio choice, for the portfolio composition between liquid and illiquid assets. Okay? Let me explain. Like, suppose, take the old view of earning dynamics. The old view was basically that the individual was subject to frequent transitory shocks. So, that's what kind of the data that we had available were able to tell us. Well, those, under that process, then households in the model would hold a lot of liquid assets for precautionary reasons, to basically buffer these shocks. Okay? Now, change your view, and imagine that the individual now, it basically faces these very, very small shocks, frequent, but they're very, very small, but then every once in a while, very infrequently, big shocks, big negative or positive shocks. Then, what is the optimal portfolio composition? Then the optimal portfolio composition is to keep very little in your bank account, right? And to instead invest most of what you have, say in housing, or in an asset that is illiquid, because it earns a higher return. And then when the shock hits, you can pay the transaction cost, and you can withdraw from the liquid account. That's the optimal thing to do. So this different nature of the earning shocks is very much consistent with a portfolio composition where households hold very little in liquid assets and a lot in their illiquid assets, because basically they can access the assets whenever they need, which is infrequently. And if you look at the data tell you exactly this. This is mean liquid assets relative to GDP, mean illiquid assets relative to GDP, and basically liquid assets are more than 10 times liquid assets. So remember, this is basically bank accounts, cash bank accounts, money market accounts, and treasuries and corporate bonds. And this is equities plus housing, essentially. Private equity, corporate equity, and housing. Okay? And the fact that you have this nature, particular nature of the income risk helps the model get in these facts. Then the model, as you can see, generates a very skewed distribution for liquid and illiquid wealth, so a lot of wealth inequality. The Gini coefficient is around 0.8, 0.85 for liquid assets. But the model also, and this is also very important, generates the right amount of hand-to-mouth households in the model. So who are the hand-to-mouth households? So hand-to-mouth households are those households that in the data basically have no liquid assets at all. So they have no liquid assets, so they have a very high marginal price to consume out of income, obviously. Now, it turns out that it's very important to distinguish between two types of hand-to-mouth households. What we call the poor hand-to-mouth, which are the ones with no liquid wealth and no illiquid wealth either. But then there is another type of hand-to-mouth households, which we call the wealthy hand-to-mouth households, which are those that have very little liquid wealth, but they have actually sizable amount of liquid assets. For example, retirement wealth or some housing wealth. And it turns out that both in the data and in the model, these are actually more numerous than the poor hand-to-mouth households. Okay? So let me tell you a little bit about the hand-to-mouth, because I think it's an interesting feature of the model and the data. Okay? So the prior, basically the conventional wisdom, I would say, until a few years ago about hand-to-mouth households was that if you think about hand-to-mouth households, you have in mind someone poor, those who have a high marginal price to consume because basically they don't know anything. They don't have any assets, any liquid or illiquid assets. And that's true, it is some of them, but in the data across countries, most of households who have very little liquid wealth, they actually have sizable amount of illiquid assets. Okay? So this is a plot of the split of hand-to-mouth households between wealthy, the blue line, and poor, the red, in the US, Canada, Australia, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Okay? And you see that a robust fact is that there are a lot more wealthy hand-to-mouth than poor hand-to-mouth. So not all hand-to-mouth households are created equal. So this is based on some work that I've done with Kaplan in the last few years. The cutoff is something like $10,000, would be $5,000, $10,000. It depends a little bit on the, but yeah.
Everybody is below small wealth and everybody is above.
Everybody above, yes, exactly. But it turns out that, okay, so if you think about these two categories, okay, think about the poor hand-to-mouth. How would you describe the poor hand-to-mouth? Well, in the US, they're about 10% of the population. They're young, tend to be young, low income, essentially no wealth at all. They clearly have a high MPC out of small changes in income, but they also have a high MPC out of large changes in income because they are poor. They basically consume everything that is given to them. And it turns out this is a transient state in the life cycle of an individual. If you look at wealthy hand-to-mouth, it's 20% of the population. They tend to be middle-aged, middle income, sizable illiquid wealth, and most of these are actually homeowners. They're essentially homeowners with a big mortgage, and they are left with the Then one thing that these houses can do, it could, for example, sell the house, right, or get a second mortgage, or sell the house and buy a. And buy a smaller house in order to smooth consumption. So there is a difference in the way the poor and the wealthy end-to-mouth respond to large changes in income. And that's really key in, for example, in understanding certain consumption response to fiscal policy. But the bottom line here is that, both of these states are relatively transient states in the data. So, there is a certain class of models that is called spender-saver models, where there is a limited amount of heterogeneity, and one agent is as a marginal price to consume of 1, and the other agent is a Ricardian agent. These are the spender-saver models, and these models appear way too simplistic in light of this description of the data. Okay, this is just a bit of a comment on a class of models. But anyway, the model can replicate these two types of wealthy and poor end-to-mouth households. And in fact, if you look at the marginal price to consume out of, say, $500, suppose in the model you give everyone $500, right? And you ask the question, how do they consume? How much do they consume of these $500? You get sort of this kind of butterfly picture, right? In which the two ridges of the marginal price to consume distribution are precisely the hand-to-mouth households, okay? The one with liquid wealth equal to 0 and with liquid wealth at the borrowing limit. Those are the only households that have very high MPC. The others have basically 0. The others are essentially Ricardian consumers with MPC equal to something like 2%, 3%. But overall, the model can replicate a quarterly MPC of 17%, an annual MPC of 50%, which is in line with the data. And this is very important because you will see that it changes some of the results in terms of transmission of monetary policy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the experiments now. And the experiments are essentially investigating what happens in this model when you have a monetary policy shock. Monetary policy shock here is, as I said earlier, a change in epsilon in the Taylor rule. And we're going to be thinking about expansion in monetary policy shock. Okay? So the Fed cuts the nominal interest rate. And these experiments are basically of the size of a 100 basis point annualized, so 25 basis points within a quarter. And then the cut of 25 basis point is going to return to steady state, basically. It's going to converge back to steady state in about something like 5 or 6 quarters. Okay? So this is the Taylor rule innovation, and this is what you care about really is the blue line, which is the real return. Okay? This is the way in which basically the central bank can affect the real return, so the real return falls. And because the real return falls, as I explained, this induces an increase in consumption, okay? And this is decreasing consumption. So I want to revisit, basically, in the context of this model, the 3 questions that I asked earlier. The first question was transmission mechanism, size of the shock, and forward guidance. Okay, so let me start from the transmission mechanism. All right, so remember this decomposition between direct and indirect effects. Now, in the simple model, the direct effect was, the effect of the liquid rate, and the indirect effect was kind of simpler. But here we have many moving parts in this model. So the indirect effect, so which generates the general equilibrium effect, is both the change in the illiquid rate, the change in the wage, and the change in the transfers. The transfers are going to be basically, I'm going to start by assuming that the transfers are what changes in the government budget constraint. Okay? So So let me start from plotting basically how all these prices change over time. So there is a drop in the liquid rate, the blue line. The illiquid rate barely moves. It doesn't move much, okay, in this simulation. The real wage goes up, and the transfers goes up. Okay, why the real wage goes up? Because of this, of this feedback effect. Increasing demand for consumption, increasing labor demand, the wage goes up. So that's the equilibrium component, one equilibrium component. Why does the transfer goes up? Well, because the real rate falls, the government has to pay lower interest on debt at some resources available. What does it do with these resources? It pays transfers. It pays transfers to households. Okay? That's the baseline assumption that we make in terms of fiscal adjustment. All right, so let's see what happens in terms of split between direct and indirect here. Remember, in the rank model, in the representative agent model, we said basically 99% of the effects were direct, was intertemporal substitution, right? Okay, so here's what happened with the blue component. So this is the change in consumption on the y-axis due to the direct component. You see it's tiny. It's very, very small. Why is it small? Basically because you have the intertemporal substitution component, but you also have a very strong and offsetting income effects. Okay? So here what happens is that there are many households, in particular the wealthy households, that they have liquid wealth. In their, they have wealth on their checking account, they hold treasury bonds, and the interest rate falls. So it's a negative income effect, and this negative income effect tends to reduce consumption. So you have basically this negative income effect that compensates the intertemporal substitution, and the two almost offset each other, and the direct effect of the change in interest rate is very, very small. So it turns out basically that it has to be clear now that most of the response, total response, has to come from the red part, which is the indirect effect, right? And in fact, well, you have very little going on with the change in the illiquid return, because the liquid return doesn't change very much, but there is an increase in the spread between illiquid and illiquid return that leads to a portfolio reallocation of households. So households, they have money in their checking account, they see the interest rate of the checking account going down, they see that basically the spread between, say, equity, the return on equity, and the return on the checking account increasing, so they invest into equity. Okay? This portfolio allocation contributes to keeping RA small, RA low, the change in RA low. Okay? But it has very little effect on consumption, you can see almost nothing. The big effect here is coming from the wage. Okay? So why? Because precisely, you have this increase in aggregate demand, increases labor demand, the wage goes up, and the fact that the wage goes up means that more income, wage income, comes into the pockets of households, and you have a sizable fraction of hand-to-mouth households in this economy, around 30%. 30% of households are hand-to-mouth, they have very high MPC, that actually consume this extra income. Okay? They consume this extra income. And the same with transfers. So in response to a fall in interest payments on debt, the government increases transfers. This increase in transfers ends up in the pockets of households who spend it, and consumption goes up. So in the end, if you sum all the red lines, this is the total, basically, general equilibrium effect. If we sum the blue line is the direct effect, you get a complete reversion, a complete reversion of the result that you had for rank. Now, almost 90% of the transmission mechanism of a monetary policy shock occurs through general equilibrium forces, and only 10% through the direct effects. So it's a completely different view of how monetary policy works in this model. Okay, so this is useful because it basically tells us how monetary transmission occurs across the distribution. Okay, so one of the nice things about this model is that you can actually plot the distribution of households. You can see how the distribution looks like. So this is the distribution of households over liquid wealth, so from negative numbers to $250,000 in liquid wealth. The blue line are the direct effects, and the black line are the indirect effects. So what you see, remember, the direct effects is the effects of the on consumption on the decrease of the real liquid rate. So you see that the blue line is positive, is low but positive across the distribution, which means that there is some intertemporal substitution, right? It's there. In fact, in this model, the IS is 1. It's a pretty high residual substitution. It's just offset by this negative income effect due to the fall of capital income. And you also see that this blue line has a spike at the borrowing limit. Why? Because, well, these are households that are heavily indebted, right? You reduce the interest rate, they can immediately consume a lot more. And you see their consumption jumps up. So those are the ones with the highest direct response. The black line is the indirect effect. This is essentially how these households consume out of wages and transfers. And you see that these spikes at 0 and at the borrowing limit, these are the hand-to-mouth households that have very high marginal propensity to consume. And so they consume a big chunk of the money that they receive. And this is why, consumption is high. And this is why the indirect effect is so strong, basically. Okay? So, to wrap up, if you compare monetary transmission in rank and Hank, and you basically separate the direct intertemporal substitution from the general equilibrium effect, you get completely opposite views. In rank, it's all intertemporal substitution. In Hank, it's all general equilibrium. Why? Because in rank, basically the rank view is that the marginal propensity to consume out of the interest rate is strong because of intertemporal substitution, and the marginal propensity to consume out of income is weak because the representative agent is a permanent income consumer. There are no liquidity constraints, no hand-to-mouth households. In Hank, the marginal propensity to consume out of the interest rate is weak because there are these income effects of the wealthy that offset the intertemporal substitution, and the marginal propensity to consume out of income is strong because there's a sizable share of households who are hand-to-mouth, and they have a high MPC. So from this, you see that it's really key to get both the bottom and the top of the wealth distribution right in this model, because both the wealthy and the poor matter for this argument. Now, what does it mean? Why these different views? What do they mean? I'm going to basically, leave a question out there. Does it imply that the Fed is less in control of the effects of monetary policy? Does it imply that the Fed is less in control of the macro effects of monetary policy? I would say so, probably, because in the rank view is that all the Fed has to do is to change the real rate, and then intertemporal substitution does the rest. Here, the Fed has to think about how basically these effects work through labor markets, possibly financial markets, the response of the fiscal side, what the fiscal side does in response to a decline in interest payments. So it's a lot more complex understanding what the macro effects can be in the end. Okay? So, I talked about the transmission mechanism, and I said also I would say something about the total size. Now, the key thing here is the Ricardian non-neutrality of this model, right? So basically, in determining the total effects of monetary policy, the role of the fiscal response is crucial. So look at the elasticity of consumption with respect to the real rate. In the case T adjust is around 2. When the government expenditure adjust is 3. When debt adjust is 0.3. So let me explain. So this all depends on the fiscal response to the lower interest payments on debt. When transfers adjust, basically, transfers stimulate aggregate demand through the high MPC of the hand-to-mouth households. when government expenditures adjust, these translate 1-for-1 into aggregate demand, right? Because, government expenditures is like basically giving money to an agent, the government, that has an MPC of 1. So it's going to spend everything. So it's going to increase 1-for-1 the demand for labor, so wages are going to go up, and this is going to trigger these general equilibrium effects very strongly. So that's a very strong effect. But when debt adjusts, okay, when it's government debt that adjusts, when interest payments fall, and what the government does, all it does is by decreasing debt and basically doing nothing else, then there is basically no initial stimulus to aggregate demand from the fiscal side. There is no transfer, no expenditures. So this reduces enormously the potency of monetary policy. Monetary policy, the effect is reduced by a factor of 7, a factor of 10. Okay? So this tells us that the fiscal response to a monetary policy shock in this class of models is really, really important. Okay. Finally, the last 3 minutes, I'm going to talk about forward guidance. So remember this forward guidance puzzle that I talked about at the beginning. So the representative agent model implies that forward guidance is even stronger than conventional monetary policy. And the idea is that there is a strong response today to future changes in interest rate because of intertemporal substitution, right? So the households knows that the interest rate is going to fall in the future. And because it's going to fall in the future, they know that aggregate demand is going to go up. So because aggregate demand is going to go up, then what firms today anticipate that and starts adjusting prices now. So expected inflation starts increasing now, and this reduces the real rate now, and so on and so forth. And because of intertemporal substitution, the effect is already very strong at time 0. Now, this seems completely implausible. That an announcement of a cut in the future seems to have such strong effect. A resolution by a recent paper by McKay, Nakamura, Steinson argues in a model similar to ours, a model with an insurable income risk and borrowing constraints, that there is a precautionary motive that tempers the response of consumption today to future interest rate, right? So basically, in a model with risk, you don't really want to start consuming a lot today and reducing your savings today if you know that the gains are going to come in the future, because in the meantime, you can be subject to negative shock, you can lose your job, and at that point, you find yourself without any liquid assets, and you're going to get a big hit in consumption. That's a fine explanation, and part of this is true in our model as well. But we have a slightly different story, which has to do, again, with the fiscal response, basically. What makes monetary policy potent, powerful, are these indirect general equilibrium effects through the increase in aggregate demand. And it's the hand-to-mouth households who are responsible for the initial stimulus to aggregate demand through the increase in the transfers, right? Now, when the interest rate cut occurs in the future, then the transfers accrue to households only in the future, not today. And so basically what we're missing is the initial stimulus through these transfers. And you can see it here in this picture. So this is a Fed announcing a transitory cut in the interest rate occurring 8 quarters at quarter 8. Okay, so this is the path of the return, which drops at quarter 8 basically, and then slowly goes back to normal. What you see is that basically the transfers peak only there, right? They basically the transfers start increasing there. That's where the money gets into the pockets of the households. In fact, if you compare the blue line, which is conventional monetary policy, the response to a transitory cut in the interest rate at t equals 0, with forward guidance, a cut occurring at t equals 8, you see that at t equals 0, the response of consumption is much, much smaller than conventional monetary policy. Okay? It's about 5 times smaller. So it's sort of all kind of sensible and plausible. There is a real effect. The effect is increasing as you get closer to the horizon, but at time 0 is very small, which is basically what empirical analysis tend to find. So this sort of resolves the puzzle. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on conclusions. I'm going to just make a bold statement, which is that, I believe that the future of monetary policy analysis lies in models with heterogeneity, away from representative agent models. This is just the first step. There is a lot to be done, a lot of other aspects of the model that need to be incorporated. But I think this is a promising, very promising direction for research in the area. And thank you very much for the invitation again.
Does anyone have any questions? We do have a couple minutes, so we'll start with speed.
You have a model with two types of assets. So you deviate from the typical Keynesian by introducing assets. But you didn't mention anything about quantitative easing, which is something you can apply in this kind of model.
Yes, that's a great question. That is, it's something that we agree with you. We think it could be potentially a good model to think about quantitative easing. And in particular, you have these two assets with different degrees of liquidity. And you can think of a shock in the model that increases, say, the liquidity of the liquid asset, which makes it harder for households to smooth consumption. And then you can think of quantitative easing, for example, as a swap, as the central bank intervening and swapping illiquid for liquid assets in order to increase liquidity and improve consumption smoothly in the economy. It's something that we're thinking about. We're thinking about what is the right shock that gets you to the zero lower bound, so that policy of this type would have a meaning. But yeah, I agree.
Are there other questions? Before we take the other question, I just want to take a few seconds to thank Dr. Gal for all of her hard work to put this evening together with all the organizations, and to Professor Decker, who handles all the academic aspects of this achievement. Thank you guys very much. We have time for one or two more questions. Alex.
Implicitly, the experiment that you make is one that is based on the notion that the central bank that is basically monetary dominant. The central bank moves first,
Yeah.
and then the fiscal authority responds. I wonder, I tend to believe personally that the world is nearer to fiscal governance than to monetary governance. If anything, it's the monetary authority that moves second after the political establishment that determines the fiscal policy move. So this leads to my question, which is, have you a feel how your results are going to change if instead of making the assumption of monetary dominance, you make the reverse assumption? In other words, you just forget about fiscal policy because fiscal policy is really exogenous. So the question really is how much of those results depend on the assumption that the fiscal policy will respond.
Yeah, no, I completely. That's a really important question, and I know you've done some important work there. The way we model the governmental constraint here is basically a passive agent that that takes the change in the nominal interest rate coming from the central bank, and then has some kind of rule and response based on that rule. But it would be interesting, and I think even exciting in terms of research agenda, to incorporate some of the insights that were developed in the literature, where you have basically these two players, the government, the fiscal authority, and the monetary authority, and you would have strategic elements basically arising in this class of models, and analyze what the implications are. We have not done it so far, and we have put all the emphasis on the monetary authority, and you could certainly make different assumptions, and there is an element of substitutability, obviously, here between monetary and fiscal policy. So what you can do, what you can achieve, to some extent, what this monetary authority is trying to do is trying to get resources in the hands of households who have a high MPC, so that they trigger this feedback mechanism. Okay? And you can do the same with fiscal policy. You can do the same with fiscal transfers, especially targeted transfers targeted to those particular agents. So there is some substitutability, and there is, if you start thinking about these two agents as decision makers, there are some strategic elements that are interesting.
Well, I think we have to wrap up now. So, Gianluca, thank you very much for a great.
Well, thanks again for the invitation.
See you again here in Tel Aviv, or maybe in Cannes.
Absolutely.
Hopefully in Tel Aviv.